We are in a little series here on Jesus before Christ. Jesus didn't just come into existence as a baby in Bethlehem. He had an eternal history before then. And so we're at the second sermon here on Jesus BC. Jesus in Jewish history, pre-exile. So, the Bible is a book, a story, a true story of redemption, of how God achieved his victory. I say achieved because the story's been completed in a way, even though we're still living it out. How God achieved his victory over Satan, sin, and death. We're all players in that story, and it's heading toward its conclusion in our lives, but we don't know when. So we're really looking this morning at Jesus, our conqueror. Jesus in the pre-exile history of Israel. Now, when was that period? Moses had died. He had led the people of Israel out of 400 years of slavery in Egypt, and during that time, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had become dim to them. They had gone back into more of a polytheistic view of God, that, the Egyptians have their gods, and I'm sure the Babylonians have theirs, and the Syrians, and there's a God that met with Abraham and so on, and so we want to do honor to him as well. But when God called Moses and said, I am the one who brought your people into this land, and they are serving for these 400 years, but I'm ready to release them and fulfill my promises to Abraham, to take them into the land flowing with milk and honey, which I promised to Abraham and all of his successors, and to continue this work of blessing all of the nations of the earth through Abraham's seed, namely Isaac, and Isaac's son, Jacob, and then Jacob's 12 sons, who were the founders of the 12 tribes of Israel. So God, that was his promise. And so from the years about 1400 BC to a very specific year, 586 BC, Israel went from being a theocracy led by the judges and the prophets, starting with Moses and then judges all the way through to the first king. They went from that to becoming a united monarchy that existed under 3 kings only as a united monarchy, when all of Israel and Judah were together. Saul, who kind of blew it, didn't really walk in the ways of the Lord adequately. David, and then his son Solomon. So from Solomon's time on, at around 930, Israel became 2 nations, known as Israel and Judah. From about 930 until 722, the nation of Israel, the 10 northern tribes, became very involved back into idolatry again. They stopped the pure worship of Jehovah, the sacrificial system, set up rival priests, rival shrines, rival sets of law, and so on. And we're drifting farther and farther away from God until he had it with them. And in 722, he allowed the Assyrians to come down from the north, destroy them, wipe out Samaria, their capital city, carry them away. And to this day, they're still known as the 10 tribes who are lost, the lost tribes of Israel. Judah, a smaller, weaker part of Israel, was not carried away by the Assyrians. God spared Judah for another 150 years. But notable about this period of history that we're looking at is after Solomon, there were 18 kings of Israel. All of the kings of Israel are described by those who did evil in the sight of the Lord. They did not follow the ways of God. All of them. During the days of Judah, after Solomon, there were 20 kings, and only 4 of them get a good report from God. So obviously, Israel and Judah were under some bad leaders for most of this time. And so, as we said, Assyria carried away the northern tribes in 722. In 586 BC, which is the end of the era that we're looking at, the Babylonians came down and laid siege to Jerusalem and destroyed Jerusalem, the city of God, the place where people took the comfort that God would never allow His temple, His holy temple, to be profaned and destroyed, let alone His holy city. But that's exactly what happened. Well, why did this happen? Why would, in the history of God's people, if He had chosen them, if He had told Abraham, through you all the nations of the earth will be blessed, if He had redeemed them out of their captivity in Egypt after 400 years, if He had taken them through the wilderness for 40 years, if He had allowed them finally to come into the land of promise under Joshua, which we'll see in a moment, why then this huge collapse of the people of God? The answer is in the very last chapter of the books that we're considering in this section. But I do want to go to the very last chapter here and read you this astonishing word, because it's so important. Because sometimes we say, well, we look at the warfare and how the genocide that God orchestrated to wipe out the Canaanites, for example. And we have a big moral problem with that. How could God just do that? And a lot of people say today, well, isn't what's going on, isn't jihad exactly the same thing, only being done by Muslims instead of Jews? Listen to this from 2 Chronicles chapter 36. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. He did evil in the sight of the Lord his God, did not humble himself before Jeremiah the prophet, who spoke the word of the Lord. He also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, who had made him take an oath in God's name. He became stiff-necked and hardened his heart and would not turn to the Lord, the God of Israel. Furthermore, all the leaders of the priests and the people became more and more unfaithful, following all the detestable practices of the nations and defiling the temple of the Lord, which He had consecrated in Jerusalem. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to them through His messengers again and again, because He had pity on His people and on His dwelling place. But they mocked God's messengers, despised His words, and scoffed at His prophets until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against His people, and there was no remedy. And so on it goes. Then it talks about the Babylonians coming down, raiding the temple, taking away all of the sacred articles in the temple, set fire to the temple and broke down the walls of Jerusalem, burned all the palaces, destroyed everything of value in them. He carried into exile, Nebuchadnezzar, to Babylon, the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his sons until the kingdom of Persia came to power. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rest all the time of its desolation that it rested, until 70 years were completed to fulfill the word of the prophecy of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, and so on. God did all that He could to win back His people. They just constantly reverted back into the detestable practices of their neighbors, who were idolaters, who were immoral, who walked in the ways of the flesh and of Satan. Let's take a look at a couple of the ways in which, though, during this time period, God gave some symbolic signal about Jesus Messiah. They didn't know His name Jesus yet, but they knew from the prophets that a Messiah, a Christ, a chosen one, an anointed one, would come as their Savior and their hero. Now they, back then, even all the way through the Gospels, even to the moment of the ascension of Jesus, with His disciples saying, Lord, are you now going to restore the kingdom to Israel? They were looking for a national hero. They were looking for a military power. They didn't understand the heart of God. They didn't understand the mission of God was not to set up an earthly empire, but to bring about a family of restored, redeemed people who would have a heart like His. Not just about a personal agenda of victory and power and national one-upsmanship. They didn't understand. Well, the book of Joshua is a book of victory. It's an exciting book. It's dramatic stories, unbelievable stories, the sun standing still for a while, for example. And I think the very first thing we see about Joshua is that his name was Yeshua. Yeshua was the name of Jesus. The name Joshua, Yeshua, Jesus, means salvation. Salvation. The name the angel told Mary, by the way, the angel told Mary to name her son, not Joseph's son, because Jesus wasn't Joseph's son. He told Mary, you shall name him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. Oops, we forgot about that last part, right? He shall save his people. That's what we want. But from their sins, this is a spiritual mission that he would have. Joshua's role was to reclaim the land God had promised to Abraham for the people for whom the Messiah would come. That was Joshua's role. Many victories were needed to establish this new kingdom. Back then, and even in the days of Jesus, many victories were needed. The ultimate victory of God, of course, is the resurrection of Jesus. All that Joshua did pales in almost insignificance compared to the resurrection of Jesus. That's what sealed the deal in terms of this great cosmic warfare that's been going on. Just as Joshua saw when he entered into Canaan with the other spies, remember Moses sent 12 in and Joshua and Caleb were among them. Joshua saw that the fruit of the promised land was worth great sacrifice, and he was eager to conquer the enemies to provide it for the people. So Jesus was willing to come to earth to win salvation for his people, to gain access to the ultimate promised land. What is that ultimate promised land? In John chapter 14, Jesus tells his followers, do not let your hearts be troubled. Don't worry. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. I go there to prepare a place for you. A place for you. A place for you. I go there to prepare a place for you. He hadn't risen from the dead yet. He hadn't been crucified yet. I go there to prepare a place for you. That's your promised land. He's promised that. If you believe Jesus to be Lord, if you believe his claims that we're secured, not just by his miracles, but by his resurrection, if you believe that, you have to believe that he goes there. He has gone there to prepare a place for you. Have you ever been excited about going to some place that you've never been before, but you've heard, wow, you'll love going there? Well, think about the place prepared for you in the heavenlies. That's there. Jesus has already won that for us. One of the stories that's so exciting in Joshua, where that we see the scarlet thread, is in chapter 2, when the spies are going across to Jericho, which is the biggest city they were going to have to conquer. We're told about them connecting to a woman who had a rather tarnished testimony, let's just say. She was a prostitute. So they somehow connected to her, and she implored them. She believed in their God. Look at verse 8 and following. Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt. Can you imagine that? These are people in Canaan. They didn't have internet or even the Pony Express back then. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death. And they promised her. And so she let them down by a rope through the window. And they said to her, this oath which you made us swear shall not be binding on us, unless when we have entered the land, you have tied this scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and unless you have brought your father and mother, and so on. Scarlet cord. scarlet thread of redemption. That scarlet cord would stand for her personal and her family's personal salvation. Why? Because she was nice to them? No. Because she had a scarlet cord? No. Because she believed in that same God. And she was trusting in that same God. She was putting her confidence in that same God. Not just her confidence in the spies that came there, but in the God that she realized was the real God. And so you know the story later on. You find the story of Joshua. You know, there's a song, Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. It wasn't a battle at all. I mean, what kind of a battle was this? They had a bunch of priests walking around with trumpets, not blowing them, going around the city 6 days in a row, carrying these priests and these shofars, actually, the trumpets, the ram's horn, the Ark of the Covenant in front of them. And then on the seventh day, they're told, go around 7 times, and the whole time you're going around, be blowing the shofar. And then God stepped in and the walls went crumbling down. That was the Battle of Jericho. They didn't have to lift a finger other than to blow the shofar. God did it. But they were obedient to God too. There's always God's part and our part and God's part. Would God have done it, knocked the walls down, if they hadn't obeyed by going? I mean, what a silly thing to do, walk around the walls blowing a horn. That's not exactly a battle strategy that we would probably employ today. But they were told to do it. Obedience activates the power of God. Obedience activates the grace of God. Sometimes people say, we've been praying for this for so long, we've been praying for this. Well, there are certain principles in a Christian life that we all know about, but if we're disobedient on them, God has no obligation to answer our prayers. He's looking for obedience. Not works salvation. We're not talking about how we get saved. We're talking about now that we're saved, how do we remain in fellowship with Him? We do so through obedience. Right beyond Judges, there's a beautiful book, a little 4-chapter book, named for Ruth. And here I think the theme is not just so much victory, but it's about redemption. It's more about security than anything. Ruth is from Moab. She was not a Jewess. She was a Moabite. And she had been married to one of the sons of Naomi, who was Jewish, and her husband died, and Naomi's husband had died. And so you have these 2 widows, and Naomi wanted to go back to Israel, and Ruth said, I'm going with you. She said, no, you stay. I'm going with you. Where you go, I will go. And so she gets back there, and here are 2 widows, no financial support, no way of sustaining themselves, but Naomi says, Ruth, why don't you just go out and glean in the fields to take some of the produce that is left by the workers? And so she does that, and the gleaning is great. She's able to provide a little bit, but that wasn't the solution to their problem. I think of the gleaning as sort of like being religious. You know, we kind of have our own works. We're going to try to keep it together and get right with God through our own works and our own religious practices and so on. That's sort of gleaning. That's not harvesting. Well, Ruth just kind of stumbled into a situation that earlier in the books of Moses talk about the responsibility of a kinsman redeemer, a law that was found in Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 to 10, if you want to read about what the kinsman redeemer is all about, where if a brother died, the other brother had to take that brother's wife as his and raise up unto his name children from her. So that happens in a wonderful romantic story. It's kind of a relief when you go from Judges to get to Ruth, and you've got this little, chick flick kind of a book here. But she is a woman of God, even as a Moabitess. And so this man Boaz, who was from the extended family of Naomi, recognized that he had a responsibility, and he willingly took that upon himself. And the story goes that he's lying one night, and Naomi says, go, Ruth, and lie at his feet. And he spread his garment over her. I think it was a pure, untainted moment by any kind of other encounter than that, other than to symbolize, I will be your protector, I will take care of you. And as you know, ultimately, they married, finally, when other kinsmen's redeemers didn't take her on. But it's a symbol of Christ in the garment, a night covering. How often does God cover us in the nights, the dark nights of our life? And we might not even realize all that He's going to do for us. In the book of Ruth, chapter 3, verse 7, it says, "When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of a grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man, and he turned and discovered a woman lying at his feet. 'Who are you?' he asked. 'I am your servant Ruth,' she said. 'Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer.' And he said, 'The Lord bless you, my daughter. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask.' He spread his garment over her. And so by being taken into Boaz's family, Ruth becomes part of the lineage of Jesus. As Rahab had, by the way. I forgot to mention that earlier. Rahab is listed in the lineage of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1. But Ruth becomes part of the lineage of Jesus. So there are two Gentile women in the lineage of Jesus. And in the case of Ruth, it talks about Ruth as becoming the great-grandmother of David. And I think it's interesting. I didn't know my great-grandmothers, but some people do have that privilege of knowing a great-grandparent. And maybe David did. Maybe there was a time when David was able to be on the lap of his great-grandmother Ruth. Wouldn't that be neat? That's not in the chick flick story, though. But there are other wonderful passages throughout these books of the pre-exile history. I'll just quickly refer to one in 2 Kings, a wonderful story about Elisha and his servant Gehazi, and they're being surrounded by the Syrians, and Gehazi is all panicked that they're going to be destroyed. And in 2 Kings 6, Elisha just says, "You know what? Lord, please open his eyes. Please open his eyes so he'll see that those who are with us are far more than those who are against us." And so God opened his eyes, and he saw this enormous army of horses, fiery horses. And so then Elisha just says, he didn't say, "Okay, horses, destroy them." No, he says, "God, please make them blind." And God made them blind. He opened the eyes of Gehazi. He shut the eyes of the Syrian armies, led them into Samaria, and put before them a wonderful banquet meal that the king allowed, and then sent them back to Syria in shame because the God of Israel had obviously won a great victory. What is the connection here? Here's a story, I think, of protection and deliverance. That God wants us to understand that God plus one equals a majority. You will never, ever be in the minority, ever. Jesus said, "I'm with you always, even to the ends of the age." I'm with you always. But we have to have our eyes opened to have confidence in that. Paul prays about the Ephesians that the eyes of our heart might be opened. And while we don't see physically these horses on fire, we know we are surrounded. We are surrounded by God's protection. The last episode I want to bring to your attention in this pre-exile history period is a story out of David's life and told in 2 Samuel chapter 9. I think this is one of the most wonderful Old Testament stories of redemption. David had been king. Saul had been his predecessor. The family of Saul pretty much had been wiped out except for one guy. David's best friend Jonathan had been killed. Jonathan had a son. His son was Mephibosheth, and the story is told in 2 Samuel of Mephibosheth as a little boy was being carried in the midst of a riot going on. He was being carried out by his nurse, and he was dropped. So he had a fall, and he was made crippled in both of his feet. Now, track with me here. Fall. Does that resonate at all? We've all had a fall. We have all been made spiritually crippled. And David, reflecting on his past and being grateful to God for where he was now as king in Jerusalem, asks the question, "Is there anyone left of the family of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake. And they said, yes, there is one. His name is Mephibosheth, but he's crippled in both of his feet. He certainly cannot do anything to help enhance the image of your palace, or militarily he can't do anything. He's just a cripple. David said, bring him in. Bring him in. Can you imagine what Mephibosheth must have thought when the emissaries of David went knocking on his door and said, Mephibosheth, King David wants to see you. Oh, he found me. He's going to wipe me out. He's going to kill me just because I'm part of the household of Saul. David brought him in chapter 9. He calms him down and he tells him, Mephibosheth, do not worry. Do not worry. He says, from now on, I will be treating you as a son. You'll be part of my family, part of my household. You will dine at my table regularly. That's not a picture of God's grace in our lives. We who have fallen, who have nothing really to offer the king that enhances his glory, he's invited us in. He's adopted us into his family. He said, now you will dine at my table regularly. And he's provided this richness for us. Well, I don't know how you want to respond to these ideas. In Joshua, we see Jesus as our victory. In Ruth, we see that he's our security. In 2 Kings, we see that he's our protection. In 2 Samuel, we see that he's our family. So let me just ask this question as we bow for prayer and then dismiss. How has Jesus entered into your history? Where do you see him being your victory? Where do you see him being your security? Where have you seen him being your protection? And do you have this sense of being in his family?